And welcome everyone. I'm very, very happy to find all of you again for tonight in EU, but of course, like afternoon in the NA side. And I'm joined with Bloodmordius, senior game designer at Omeda Studio, and that will be a blast because we are going to discuss about character creation, like the whole process of how we get a new character in the hands of player. How are you doing tonight, Blood?
Yeah, I'm doing amazing, thanks. It's been a good day at work, so yeah, I'm pretty excited to progress with this show. Pretty fun.
A good day of work. I think we all love to hear that.
Mm.
Can you just like for those people, like I think most of the people in the scene kind of know you, but if you can just like resume once again, what is your like who you are, what are your responsibilities at Omeda Studio, and this type of thing.
Yeah, so yeah, Meta, I'm a senior game designer. I've been that for about a year or so now. Worked my way up from essentially a junior, and before that, just a consultant. I was working for free. But yeah, so I've been here for quite a bit. I handle pretty much all the gameplay systems in some regard when it comes to actual in-game interactions and everything. So from heroes to items to all that stuff and the player experience within the game. And then I'll touch on whatever else is needed as well. We're, as a smaller team, pretty versatile in what we have to look at within the game and scope. So design often ends up reaching into monetization, all these other areas of the game, as well as systems and out-of-game systems. So I tend to assist with those from time to time. But my main focus, especially as of recent, is definitely heroes. We've recently had Ray come back on board, and he's been helping me a lot with balance, which has taken a massive load off my chest, which means I can actually focus on heroes a lot more and get them up to quality.
Yeah, so like not having to go into the numbers so much and can actually like go into the creative aspect of what is like very, very, very fun. I was willing to ask you like also like how is life working at Omeda and like overall like so far how it's been going because like we always hear love to hear a little bit about like the behind of the scene stuff basically.
Yeah, no, I love the way it works. So we don't have an office that we go into day to day. It's all online with everyone. So I'm talking to people that are all over the world, which is a blessing and a curse in its own regard. Some days it would be lovely to hop into an office, speak face to face, do meetings face to face and stuff, and interact with people in that way. But overall, the way we've sort of functioned online has been very efficient. And I think it's a really good structure we have. I really enjoy that I can speak with all these people across the world and all these different cultures and stuff just from day to day. In work culture, I think it's super fun, super exciting, super interesting. I love a lot of the sort of like interactions I can have with my colleagues because of it. And yeah, so I mean, I usually just show up in the morning and it's always opening with meetings as we do every day. We make sure we're always synced up with the relevant departments and everything. Um, and just in general, yeah, we can truck on with the day. The whole culture is very open, even though we're not in an office. Voice channels are fairly open in most cases, so most people just sit in them, and you can join and hop around and chat to each other and stuff, or get what you need. So I'm usually sat in our design chat most of the time, and anyone can catch me if they need me, kind of thing. And I can sort of have a lot of interaction with people that way, and it's almost like just someone walking up to your desk and having a chat with you in that regard, which is really pleasant. Um, and yeah, overall, the people are nice. The structure's great. Feel very looked after. My boss is great, and it's all fantastic. Yeah.
That's very interesting because like I personally have absolutely no experience with like full remote working, and so that's actually like interesting like how you were sharing, and I guess like this like early meeting kind of allow like to basically share everything with everyone so everyone is on board and kind of know what everyone is doing, which I think is important because you can't really like hear your colleague like working on something because you just like tend to hear. And also like this aspect of voice channel, and in a sense I guess also like sometimes it's probably like very great when you just need to really focus on something, like you don't get distraction in a way, so I guess you also have like
Yeah.
this advantage when you just like need to go into like a specific task.
Yeah, I mean, we do call it cages. Sometimes lock ourselves in a cage, which means that we don't let anyone contact us and focus on work to buckle down on certain topics and stuff, which is pretty enjoyable. But overall, yeah, it's pretty free. It does comes with its like its downsides, all the sort of remote work and stuff. Production is a more tricky task in general, and keeping everyone aligned is more tricky. Structuring all that stuff, so we do have things that we need to, there's all road bumps to hit and cross. But overall, it's been going pretty well. We're improving in that regard, and our processes are getting cleaner. Overall, we're still somewhat in our infancy as a studio, and therefore we're still building all that up as well. So there's lots of little kinks to work out, but overall, yeah, we're getting much better and much quicker, which hopefully people will start seeing the results of soon.
And it's also like from what I extract from all of that is like you're basically applying the mentality that you have on the game, which is like you're not scared to experiment, but learn from your mistake and improve from there. Like you also applying that on the mentality of the business, because like you said, like it's a new structure, everyone needs to learn, but apparently everyone is eager to learn. And so little by little, the whole process will get better. And in that sense also like the early access I guess is super like instructional for you guys, because you also like discover a little bit how it works in production and like how to like get better pipeline and process overall.
Yep.
One last question when we're talking about like those generic topic and such, like it was like overall, how do you like, is the community nice to you overall in general?
I tend to get much more positive reception than negative amongst the community, and in my experience. When you read through Discord feedback threads, it may not always seem that way. But any messages I get in my DMs or anything, I always say I'm open so people can do it. And then they do. And people are very nice and very polite about the way they approach it, and the way they talk to me. I don't get like, there's a Twitter thread recently from Mortdog who does TFT. He's the lead designer on TFT. And they recently had like a new set come out. And he did a big Twitter thread on the idea that he's getting death threats and that there's horrible things coming from the community. You can get some horrible stuff. I mean, even back in my days streaming, I also had stuff of the same caliber. But so far working on Pred, none of that. It's all been pretty clean. It's been pretty happy. Everyone's been fairly positive, and I get a lot of nice positive messages. It's really nice. Someone back from the Paragon days just messages me. It's just like, thank you so much for bringing this whole thing back. It means a lot to me. It's reconnected me with people, and it really makes me feel like you're making a difference with this stuff. So yeah, it's really good. And all the negative sort of criticism you see in feedback threads and stuff, I don't really consider it that negative. A lot of it's just, even if it's not somewhat constructive, my job's to break it down and deal with it as feedback. And why do they feel this way? What caused them to feel this way? Is there ways I can alleviate that for the player? Is it actually something we're doing wrong in certain areas, and can we improve? And that's the mentality I approach that stuff. So I don't really see it as much of it sort of like probably raw anger that can go into typing those comments when I do see them.
So I would have like probably like a little message for the chat, which is basically like, if you feel good about what Bloodmordius is doing, like always like send a little message. That way it keeps like the positivity and can actually like tackle the negative message that are most of the time like sometimes valuable and criticism. But when you have like only like the negative aspect, like sometimes it's kind of can get rough. But so far I'm happy overall. Like also like myself as a streamer, I feel like the community is pretty like nice so far and pretty open. So it's very great to be part of this whole journey basically together and advancing.
Yeah, it's lovely.
So now we can like move into like the meat a little bit of the topic. So for those joining us, like it will probably like be split in two parts. This thing are related, but it's just like to make it a little bit like easier to follow, and also like that way like Bloodmordius can be like directing a little bit more his answer. And so the first part is really like will be towards like how do we like design a hero, more like on the game design aspect, like all the things that the game designer needs to think about. How do we get like into a kit something functional, what the thing that they are thinking about, what are like the great practice, the traps to avoid, all these little things. So that's will be like the first part, and then we will have a second part, because it's nice when you have a game design document that tells you like what the hero will be about, but then you have like to have all the artistic part, like the 3D models, like the animation, all the visual effects, the sound, probably I would assume like testing, like basically all that additional process that we need to make the hero a reality, and that ends up into our hands. And so let's start with the first part, is like what is the starting point when it comes to character creation?
Yeah, so I guess I should talk about the sort of pillars and rules we initially established when approaching heroes. So this is something that I've sort of outlined myself to most of the company and stuff, and this is the way I'd like to approach hero design and stuff. I do most of the current character design as it is, so I've sort of done that as sort of a guideline for myself and anyone else that'll be introduced to in the future, so that everyone's on the same page as with the way I approach this stuff. So first off, like one of the main pillars is just overarching goal. The idea is to have a new hero that players can enjoy. It's very standard. And then what does it do beyond that? The character, right, and try and describe that. So that's like the first thing that we establish. The second is that we need to be able to produce a bare bones version of this character. So we have prototype mock-ups that are done on like Unreal dummies. This is one of our like standard things. We require this every single time we make a new character. We focus on frequent delivery, so iteration is really important for character design, probably more than like most features and stuff. You can constantly send a character into testing and it comes back, and in that one session you can get so much feedback out of it that you then want to just change it, and you just want to run it again, and you want to run it again and again, and that's how you get the best result. The more you can iterate within a period of time, the better it's going to be, and that goes for most things, obviously, in development. But here is super important. Date ranges, establish the date, what's the start of this character in terms of like we're beginning now, when does it have to be done by, and how are we going to structure that out. There's the concept of the team. So even though I might own a character design, everyone is free to give feedback on it. People are free to provide ideas and information that they have that could be like useful for myself to carry on designing it. Even though there is a designer per character, we always make sure that everyone is able to contribute towards the design, whether it's the kit, the visuals, anything at all. We have internal QA, which allows us to then iterate quickly. So this is still one of our pillars. We need to make sure that the character can be tested internally without the need of external help in order to do this fast iteration. And then we need to be able to extract data, right? We need to look at Paragon heroes as a model, as well as potentially other characters from other MOBAs as a model for data, and figure out what should our future characters look like in kit and visuals and everything. So what does that sort of market look like? So yeah, when we like initially start, the things I'm kind of looking for are like, so what holes do we have within Pred in our character design? What themes are we missing? What roles? What classes? What sort of themes are popular? In current market and stuff. What's being released? What's exciting? And then do we have any sort of like unique mechanics to utilize or anything like that? Because a lot of the time when we're prototyping characters, these things can just cycle in and out with different kits. And the reason we do that is not just necessarily because that will be a character itself, it's because that character is harboring certain mechanics that allow us to test them. This could be something that's completely brand new. So an example could be it spawns stuff on the map, and when you pick up that stuff grants you something. That's something a character doesn't have in this game currently. It's more like something like Bard from League of Legends or something. And when you develop a new mechanic like this, you pop on a prototype, see if it works within a certain kit. That kit may not be best for that ability or anything, but you'll see how that mechanic functions if people enjoy interacting with that loop and things. And then how can we incorporate those abilities into future designs where they can be built around the idea of those mechanics. So these are like kind of all the main things I think of before I even start diving into like actually making a kit for a character in design. Do you have any questions this far while I'm ranting?
Well, it's quite like a big list before even like starting. So as we can see, like there is like a lot of sort of even like it's not just like, oh, let's make a character. Like there's actually like a lot of things that go behind it. So I started to net a few questions, but I think I will probably like ask them when we reach them during like the character creation process. Like for instance, like you reference like the dummies and the iterative loop, and I'm actually like curious about it. But I think it's something like when you're already got a little bit of a kit that you want to try fast and see how it works. So we can like come back to it at that moment. I remember like someone like asked me like a question about in those lists before like you go into like a character. I would assume like does also like you consider, I would assume, like the current cast and like probably like which like roles need to be filled or which like other type of direction and that you want, like, other type of fantasy that you want to introduce into the game.
Yeah, definitely. We always consider the holes in what classes, roles, and stuff before even making one. As we've seen, like with our unique characters so far, in terms of Kira and the upcoming Lizard, we're fulfilling an ADC character, we're fulfilling next an offlane character. For the next few, those will most likely not be for those roles, presumably. The best thing we can do is, sort of spread it out a little bit at first to show what we can make for each one. And then it's really looking at, from the Paragon cast, from those 5, do we have anything else that we're like missing from the Paragon cast that's significant, right? Are there enough carries? Are there enough supports and stuff? That will always be considered. And then, if that's somewhat satisfactory, then you can start diving into classes and stuff, right? Like the play styles within each role. What is missing, right? Do we have enough like shorter range mobile ADC sort of style kits or longer range poking ADC style kits? Do we have enough burst mages, battle mages, things like this, which will then help us fulfill what we need next? And as we start to fill all of that out, then we can start getting a bit more creative and unique with character designs as well, because there's sort of something for everyone then, and all the different play styles. So yeah, that's super important. But yeah, that's mostly the sort of envisionment and sort of like proposal stage when you start like writing up the kit and thinking about it. When it comes to the actual kit itself, I tend to like visual inspiration from things. I'll try and sort of think about I'll look at like Pinterest or all sorts of like imaging sites and stuff, and just looking at concepts of characters I think could be really cool just to see in the game, right? If you just put this into Pred, what does it look like? And what would a kit for that look like? It's a really good way to just sort of like dive into sort of exploring ideas of mechanics and new stuff. And sort of like unique sort of characters within our system, because it can be something that's very different then from a visual standpoint. And then I'll just be thinking about gameplay loops within that. And then as soon as I find something that I'm like, yeah, I really like that mechanic, like I'll see like an Arctis type character, and they've got like a really cool bow, but the bow can actually like transform into a sword or something as like a mechanic, as like a visual mechanic. I can then think of that in like within the encompassment of a kit, and it's like, oh, maybe we can do like a stance switching character, right? And their weapon switches between a bow and a sword as part of their kit. And then you can start designing around that, right? And then, what sort of class does that fit into and stuff? Is that fitting into what we want? And then you can start developing sort of abilities for that. And as you start to like develop that paper kit, you can start to get a feel for the loop and everything. So I tend to design around either two concepts, core gameplay loop or core ability. So if I was doing a stance switcher, the core ability is the stance switching. The nice thing about stance switcher is you've probably got two sets of abilities or something along those lines, and you develop like two loops within that kind of interact, which is a bit more complex. But if it was something simple, just like a very standard ability that just kind of did one thing, but that was the core ability you build around, you're probably going to be thinking of all the different abilities that could complement that, right? And sort of integrate with that kit. Likewise, if it's like a cool ability that kind of fits into something, like if it's like a sort of like an ability that requires setup, it's like, how do I set that up? And then once you have an ability that's how you set that up, is there any like follow-up after that combo of those two abilities and how they work? Is there any way you can make those intertwine a little bit more of each other so they can be done alternative ways, right? If you have like a sort of a pull into like a knockup, can you then shift that into a way where the knockup is good for the pull? Well, if the pull is more telegraphed, that makes it harder to land, so the knockup's more reliable. So then that means you either pull if they're at range and you pull them, and that means you can then knock them up. But then the pull's hard to land, so if you're actually closer, you can actually knock them up now, and that makes the pull easier to land, so then you can pull them closer. So there's like different gameplay loops you can start to establish just from like two mechanics that you've built. And then the third ability, that you'd have as a basic ability, you then integrate into that loop. And that's sort of the way that I approach kits and sort of like build upon them into certain mechanics and try and keep the class in mind. Like if it's like a sustain-based character, then does it need sustain? If it's a tank, does it need CC? If it's support, does it need CC? Think about damage types, and then you start getting to itemization and all these other topics.
So like if you try to summarize a little bit like all the thing that we've been discussing like here. So if I understood correctly, like the inspiration can come like from multiple things. Like sometimes like you're just looking at the concept and you see like the concept like as a character is very interesting and how it could like be, and sometimes you're looking like at abilities, I guess, like you were talking about Pinterest, and these abilities can be a starting point. Sometimes I assume like it's even like can be like the class that you're trying to like add, and you say like, oh, maybe you can start with that. So like basically like the entry point can come like from so many different angles,
Yes.
and you're not limiting yourself as a specific order, because like creativity can come from many different things.
Yeah.
And then like you enter into the kit, and when it comes to the kit, from what I understood, like there's like two main approaches to it. We have like the core gameplay loop approach, when it's basically like how all the abilities are going to chain together and make like the character being fulfilling to play and enjoyable to play. And there's like the other approach, which is like the ability approach, when you have like very, very cool abilities that you think like are strong, and you just like put them into the kit, and you kind of build from there in a sense. I I have a question about like this whole process, like of like
Mm.
finding ideas. Like as you said, like you go on Pinterest, you try to inspire yourself from like what you see. I would assume like also inspiration from your experience as a MOBA player in the past. But is it also like something that sometimes is done as a team, like maybe some brainstorming session or taking inspiration for other people and just like, or maybe it's something like sometime like discussing with other people in the team?
Yeah, that's something that we're definitely sort of developing a bit more over time, I think, because initially with our unique designs and stuff, they've come across pretty quickly, and it's because people have always contribute ideas, right? We just have design chats and stuff, and people contribute what they'd like to see in the game and things like this. And this stuff gets shared a lot. And when we see things that we like, we then tend to take them and see if we can make designs out of it, right? So we haven't had to do that for the first few characters because things are already established there in terms of the direction we want to go, based on role and themes and stuff that have been shared. So they're already like sorted. Whereas when it comes to like future sort of things, we would have more sit downs and sort of like ideation phases where especially sitting down with like art team I think is super important, and narrative. So the way like a Riot approach sort of hero design initially is they have the DNA process, which is design, narrative, and art. And it's basically having one person, so the lead hero designer of that hero, basically, which would, for example, be myself. Then you'd have an art person, let's say like our concept artist Lucas. And then you'd have a narrative person, which we don't have any narrative people currently, but you'd have someone like that, and all three of you would come together, and you'd chat about the issue ideas, right? The artist would draw things that inspires the designer and the narrative person. The narrative person would come up with stories that inspires the artist and the designer, and the designer comes up with kit mechanics and stuff that inspires the narrative person and the artist. And they bounce this back and forth until they come to sort of the conclusion they want, usually within some sort of bounds that they've set before based on theme or class or whatever it may be. So that's usually the process they go for, and that's something I'd love to build like within Omeda, basically, in terms of that process in the long term as we start to get deeper into hero creation. I think it's a very efficient way for people to get aligned and approach this sort of topic from like multiple different angles and perspectives. And I think that's like going to be really healthy for like the future of our hero creation sort of process. I definitely think it's super important.
And so like that brings me like a question that probably like regarding the lore, like is like for now like the lore already like a part a little bit of the creation or sometimes can be a starting point because like you want to explore, like I think you mentioned at some point that you really love like non-humanoid characters, and so like that can dive into that. And is it like something that is already like in place a little bit in Omeda, or for now like with gameplay first because we're trying to have like this core gameplay like very Polish, or it's something that will be built upon in the future?
Yeah, so we're definitely still gameplay first and focused on that currently. And as I said, we've got no like proper narrative designers on board yet, so that kind of falls under game designs like Rain at this point. So seeing as I do most of the hero design, I try and keep a world in my head kind of thing, in terms of how this functions. I've done some documentation on it to keep it on paper and sort of able to sort of understand it better for everyone. But there is a world there that these characters then reside in, and I can make the connections with. Very much probably inspired from like Paragon's idea if there's several different realms or whatever, or worlds or moons, whatever it may be. And these characters would be sort of from there, but then they all come collected to this one area, and that's the way you explain how they all are. And from doing that, you can sort of put them into camps of the sort of like type of character they are. So obviously, like Richter's from a very similar realm as like Steel, whereas Feng Lao's from a very similar realm as like Sparrow or Guang or whatever. And all these characters kind of like lump into sort of batches together. And when creating our new characters, we very much do that, right? So we want to include story because it's super important for like making the character feel more like a character rather than almost an NPC you're playing or anything like that. You want them to have a story, you want them to be interesting and then be relatable in some senses and stuff. So Kira, we did a very bare bones, easy sort of idea of the whole countess sort of interaction with the whole hunting stuff, and then taking out the vampire. It's very sort of like familiar story that people can sort of relate to and understand, and that's pretty easy, and it's a good way to sort of build upon her character and what she's trying to do. There's more stuff we wanted to do with that, but being smaller, we weren't able to achieve it in terms of story and lore and fun things we could present. So yeah, that didn't go as far. Whereas like with Lizard, we're kind of doing the same thing. When I design the story, I think about where this character would reside within our universe. So spoilers, leaks, whatever. This character resides in the universe where Feng Mao would come from, for example, and that's where I placed him when sort of thinking about him with his kit and his sort of like visuals and everything. And this is where I want him to be established. So this is something that did come later in the kit design. It's not something that was just from the get-go and made sense. So it's not as narrative driven as I'd like it to be, like with a DNA team. This one's much more art and design driven, and the narrative's kind of put on top. This character would have relations with characters like Feng Mao in terms of story and stuff. That's going to be like a pretty deep tie-in. We're going to be doing voiceover work for it. Maybe there'll be some specific voice interactions in future, which I think is super important for characters. I think it's super cool when they talk to each other and you learn the story throughout the gameplay as well. And if we do achieve that, then he'd be a character that talks to Feng Mao, basically. They're going to be quite like deeply tied in lore, for example. So yeah, I think it's really important to establish that stuff, and it's super exciting. But our characters at the moment, narrative comes a bit more secondary to the other two pillars.
Yeah, it's understandable. If I go back, like still like in this early phase of iterating on the kit, trying to find like some ideas, like on the game design aspect, if there's like, for instance, some like wannabe game designer in the chat, like I have like two questions. One is like, what type of resources you would recommend them? I don't like, I know you talk about class. Is there like already like class like document that exists? I would assume like there's a lot MOBA out there. And the second like question will be more about like, is there like any like specific trap to try to avoid when you're like in this ideation phase at the beginning?
Hmm. Yeah, when it comes to sort of like learning this design stuff, a lot of where I came from, so obviously I'd played MOBAs forever, and I think being very ingrained, especially not just in like a particular genre, but almost subgenre of game for so long, you really do pick up all the stuff that's been done over that period of time, living with games like League and Smite and Dota throughout their entire lives, and experiencing everything the design teams went through all that time. You pick up a lot from that. Otherwise, it is very much looking for courses and stuff online. There's some very standard sort of like design principles that you should go learn, like the 3Cs and stuff. There's courses for online and stuff, and people can pay for and do. And then obviously there's obviously degrees and stuff you can do for it. I'm very much sort of like more on the side of sort of I think people should be driven more by like their passion for the thing that they're working on, and I feel like that's the best person to learn. And if they're super passionate about it and they go out of their way to find ways for themselves to learn and improve in that field, then they're going to be like really good at the role basically. So for someone that would go out of their way and they've got a lot of experience in the thing, and then they go and take that, and they try and like understand that sort of experience more, right? Because they're sort of delving into your previous experiences and understanding and breaking them down, right? So a lot of what I did when Paragon died was looking back into sort of league patches and stuff. Why did they do things? Why did these things go this way? And understand all that to sort of like understand what my experience with that was. And then I went ahead and learned additional skills that are obviously going to be super beneficial. So C++ and Unreal Engine, and there's courses on like Udemy for that and stuff. That's been super useful for me. And then it's just doing stuff, right? I think experience in the actual work itself is more important than, learning about what that experience should be elsewhere for a couple of years, like 2 years working at Pred. I've learned guaranteed millions more than I ever would have learned taking courses or anything or going to school for this kind of stuff. It's absolutely fantastic for that kind of thing. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff that the way I'd approach that stuff and how I have approached it. And what's the second question? Sorry.
Like the second question was like during this ideation phase, is there like
Mm.
any traps that we need to avoid?
Yeah, so I'd say the largest issues is getting too caught up on there's a couple of things. Well, one's getting caught up on like one sort of like big idea behind what the character is. I think establishing a visual direction that's very sort of like shoehorned is very poor early, and that's something that we've actually learned quite recently at Omeda, I think, by establishing like this character is going to look this way and this is their theme and that's what it's going to be, and designing within that space as a game designer for the kit is actually very restrictive. I feel like this stuff should be done at the same time and sort of like met to and from, so that this art team need to convey with this design team constantly as the abilities and kit are created, as the sort of thematic is created. and agree on those ideas and then backpedal quicker, basically, before you start hitting points where it's like, the art team have this amazing concept and this is really cool character design, but we just can't make a good kit for it. It doesn't really work in our space or anything, or it's just not time, and you need this thing out sooner because it said date ranges is like super important. I think this stuff has to be created like very, very much together. So never push too far one way, and that goes for gameplay too in terms of a kit. You can't make an entire kit. It's just like what visually makes sense in this kit, right? It might just be something that completely misses the mark. So you can't go too far one way without doing these things in tandem, which is why alignment is super important when it comes to like all these sort of areas of design. And I'm sure narrative will end up being that way as well. I'm sure our stories and ideas behind how these characters relate are fairly weak right now, and then they're a very, very sad part of the way our characters are designed. I think they could feel much more alive if we had more narrative pumped into them. So the closer that's put into the sort of initial design stages, the more that will alleviate. And then when it comes down more to the specific design stuff, when it comes to sort of like pitfalls you can run into with hero design, one thing you should probably try and avoid is like there seems like very obvious solutions in hero design that will never be the case. Never think you've like solved a kit on paper, basically. When you play that thing in game, it is completely different experience. There's things that I've created and I'm just like, this is going to be the coolest experience for a player ever. I'm so excited. And I play in game, I'm like, this is so awful. What have I created? I need to go back. I just need to fix this. And you can end up pretty much scrapping the whole thing over it. And it can also be really discouraging when something you're so confident in ends up failing. In the end of the day, it's almost impossible to see how these things play realistic in realistic scenarios in the gameplay space. And you have to test and iterate often in order to achieve what you want. So very much like, take your designs as you create a character with a massive grain of salt until they're actually put in, and think about them more carefully there and not get too attached to them, because you will probably end up scrapping 80% of the stuff they work on. For example, Lizard is a really good example of this. I've gone through so many kits on this character. This final kit iteration is the product of I'd say at least 30 abilities beforehand, of different abilities and combinations of them and things that they do, that have led into very similar sort of like play styles and everything. It's still achieving all our goals, but they miss the mark in so many different ways. And they just don't feel good to execute in terms of their combos and those core gameplay loops, or the power fantasy just isn't there, and there's just not enough weight. There's always like really big issues of that. So yeah, just don't get attached to them, because I've thrown away so many abilities already, and now I'm pretty stone cold when I put this kit in and play, and I'm like, yeah, let's see if this actually works before I get too excited.
There is a saying like in creative work that you have to kill your darlings, because like at some point
Yes.
like you just have like it's probably like only 5% of what you produce that's actually like very, very good, but you still need to produce like the rest to improve and finally find out what is very, very nice. I want just like also like maybe like when you like go for this ED like brainstorm ideas and at the beginning, is this like sometimes some sort of limit? Because like as a player, or when I try like sometimes to imagine something, I'm just like having, oh, this idea sounds good. Oh yeah, it's probably overpowered. Is it something like also that you have to be careful, because like you never know what the idea can be transformed into, or it's immediately like, oh no, it's not fitting inside our game design space basically.
Yeah, I try and push away from anything in terms of overpowered, underpowered initially. In terms of my brain, I like to think as far as possible in that regard. If there's an ability, like if the whole point of this character is it's meant to be like super mobile, and we're playing in a vertical space, maybe this character should fly, right? That's one thing we've considered multiple times, for example, and it's always a hard one to come by because it is a very overpowered ability. The ability to be off the floor for a limited period of time. We've seen it of how it's all melee characters can't interact in the MOBA space. It can be super rough. Um, but but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try it and you shouldn't do it and you shouldn't iterate on it, right? We'll have character designs that fly and then they fail and it's just too powerful of a budget just to have that flight with nothing else, and then you have to like backpedal. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work in future, and it could be a really good idea and you could get really good learnings out of it that you can adapt to other sort of abilities and similar concepts. So I always try and push away from the idea of like, oh, I don't think I should do this, it's too broken. It's like, no, try it first in game, see if it's actually good. Because especially with overpowered, it's normally good, right? Especially reading on paper. You can read out a lot of kits from MOBAs, whether it's Smite or League or Dota, and you just read them on paper, and you'll just be like, wow, that's so OP. Like, that's so crazy. And that's almost the feeling you want to create when people read your character's kit. When a new character comes out, you want people to have that feeling, because that means they're excited to get in there and try it and want to use it and having the space, and it's going to change things up. That means it's innovating a bit more. So people bring it in, they're just like, wow, that's amazing. So the last thing you want is to see a kit on paper and you're just like, yeah, that seems balanced. That's not fun. That's not exciting, or interesting. So on paper it definitely should be. And usually when it translates in game, it's not as much so. These things are usually toned down, and obviously numbers have a massive impact on this, and even the smaller things, whether it's the cast time of an ability or something, can massively impact how powerful a character can be, and the way it's played and stuff. So there's so many factors that you can tweak and tune and sort out that I wouldn't worry about that until you start to get to the final stages. That's when we start to get to balancing, but that's after the kit's sort of already established. You're looking at this kit, you're trying to keep it like sort of cohesive and strong, and then you can start thinking, what's the counterplay and all that stuff. And once you've gone through all that, after that counterplay segment, is it balanced? If not, can we do balancing on numbers and stuff, and all that area? And then after that, if it's still struggling, maybe you need to backpedal and go change a couple things. I mean, even games like League have in the past, they've stripped mechanics off of characters that are just like on top of it, which completely changed the identity, whether that's like removing the true stealth on Akali's W that allowed her to tower dive, because towers didn't take tower aggro when she walked under them, when she had this ability active. They will strip this stuff back because they know it's too strong, and it's to a point where you can't really balance it without ruining the rest of the character. So there will be times when you do have to do that, but it's better you explore that stuff first, because if it works, it can be something that completely innovates the space and makes your game for the better by so much more than what a normal design would do.
Yeah, and you mentioned like really saying that in the end of the day, it's a video game. True, it's a competitive video game, so we need like some like competitive fairness, but people needs to be excited. They need to have fun when they read a character, when they play the character, and like having like everything that is kind of blend. In the end, it's not like a fun experience for anyone.
Yeah.
On this earlier kit, like I remember there was like a question in the chat that was asking you if you had the opportunity to bring like any abilities or like from another MOBA that you have seen that you think like were really cool, what would it be into like which I assume that probably like already character in the back end that already like probably have some of those stuff, but of those that we don't know.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some prototypes that have some interesting mechanics I'd like to see in the game. But in general, like things that we don't actually have functioning in the game right now. We don't have things that play on the extreme vertical plane, even like Smite do. So Empty and I were chatting actually earlier about this today, where in Smite you have characters like Ram or Neja that take characters up to that sort of like extra plane. In our game, that's so much cooler than Smite, because you can look up and see the moment as other players, but you can also interact with it a degree, right? You've got things like Muriel ult, you've got things like Murdoch ult. You can attack or help these characters that are up on that like ridiculously high plane, with certain unique interactions that you wouldn't see with other characters. And I'd love to see abilities that interact with that sort of plane in our game, whether it is like a Rama or a Neja or anything like that. I think it brings a lot more sort of like dynamic sort of verticality to the game that isn't like that more abusable one where it's playing on that sort of like just higher than 2D plane where they can interact with everyone in the 2D plane. But yeah, they're obviously out of
Imagine
reach.
the moment when there's like a Murdoch sniping someone like out of the air and it just like stop in action and like
Yeah.
yeah, definitely like there's like some those cool moments that can happen in tournament and such. So yeah.
Yeah, it'd be really exciting to see. I think it's a really cool concept that we should definitely be exploring.
Okay, so now like we talk about like how to get like our first kit on paper, and then you also like mentioned that it's super important to be able to test and iterate and like get feedback and fast like basically like a very fast loop. And so like first like my question would be on term of the process, how it works like technically, because like I assume like every time like you have like completely like new ability, like you were talking about like spawning stuff on the map and then like grabbing him for instance, like I guess like there's like dev involved to be able to test, but we don't want to invest too much on a feature that we don't know if it's going to work or now. And how like what are the little tricks, like you mentioned like dummies, I would assume like that's like default 3D models that you can use with like basic animation, or if you can iterate a little bit on that, explaining a bit the process and how like at Omeda you do that to allow yourself to be able to test and have like those feeling with the keyboard and mouse or the controller in hand.
Yeah, so yeah, after kit's pretty much established, we know the direction we have to take it. So on a technical level, with how we work in Unreal, um, we have initially sort of tables and data tables and all that stuff to set up, which is just data entry. So there's a ton of that we have to do. What are all the variables we're going to have exposed within the kit, like damage numbers and things that will be dynamic. The characters like temporary name and everything, all this stuff, UI data and filling in all this sort of easier stuff. Funny enough, I did make a character this just previous weekend, a prototype character in my free time because I just love making characters for this game. So I just went and did one because I was bored. It took me about 12 hours total. Previously, it would take me like 24 plus or something. The process has gotten super clean where compared to where it was before. So I can actually pump out like prototype characters pretty quick on a whim and iterate them much better, which is super exciting. But I always try and go the extra mile of our prototype characters. So what we do is we take a default sort of Unreal 4 dummy. So we still have the Unreal 4 dummy, not the 5 dummy. And I like to play dress up. I like to take elements of Paragon characters and slap them on. So maybe this character uses like Seraph's mace, and it has like Crunch's head, and it has like Fangmail's legs and all these different things. So I'll attach different parts to it, and that will help give it different silhouettes, which actually makes it more recognizable in game when we're testing it, which is really nice because I think gameplay clarity wise, these designs are better received by either testers or internally if these characters have these elements put onto them. So we have a really nice dynamic system for allowing us to attach these different bits of pieces and stuff like that. Likewise, the animation system super dynamic. We have every single Paragon character animation, including minions and everything, retargeted to the Unreal dummy. So I can use any of those for abilities, for basic attacks, movement, anything like that. So if this is a female character, I'll go and take one of the female characters' sort of running animations and everything and get all those set up. That system's a little more rigid, so I do have to go in manually and hook a lot of this stuff up in animation blueprinting and stuff, which I've learned how to do pretty much, and just how to slot everything in. Ruba's made the system pretty good. Set up some blend spaces and stuff so they flow a little bit better in their movement. And then once all that movement's set up, I've got a dummy, it's dressed up, it's probably a certain color. We try and use different colors for different dummies. This one might be red. And then it's got a movement set, and then I set up its basic attack, so we set up gameplay abilities for these. Normally we copy and paste stuff from other characters pretty easily, files are pretty transferable. I'll then make all the animation montages for it and plug those in. That's the most fitting, so if this is a character that needs to swing very slow, heavy swings or something, it could be something that's like Steel's attack animation or Crunches or something, whereas if it's someone that uses like a certain type of weapon, like a sword, it might be Greystone or something. So we use the most fitting sort of basic tech animations, hook all of those up that are retargeted to that dummy and get all that set up. And then you've kind of got your blank slate, right? You've got your raw dummy, and he's got his own unique silhouette. And now you need to basically make all the abilities, and then you got sound and VFX. Those like the next 3 stages. So you start developing the kit. Normally, if there's anything too complex, so for example, like this morning in the world thing, we don't have a character that does that yet. No one does it. There's nothing to reference, and we probably don't have the systems built. Some things might need to be done in C++, or it's very complex blueprinting logic, to the point where I'll have to get an engineer to come help me develop those kind of things. They usually don't take that long for a prototype, so it's not a worry if we need to go out of the way to try these things, especially if they're mechanics that can be used in multiple areas in the future and reused again. It's always worth building them so we can get those built. Otherwise, I'm pretty much like using other abilities as templates, right? If I'm going to make an ability that is like a skill shot and then it does like a cone at the end, I'm going to take like, I don't know, howitzer rocket. I'm going to strip that down in its blueprints. Apply maybe a different looking projectile. Maybe it looks like a rock, like Rampage Rock, so I'll put a Rampage Rock. The character can maybe throw it using Richter's hook animation, so he throws the hook animation, the rock comes out, and then when it hits a target, it can do a cone behind them. Maybe we use like I don't know, like sort of countesses, like sort of dark tide VFX, and that sprays out behind the rock or something. And then you can like retexture, rematerialize it or whatever, and hook all that up, and then you make an ability. And you basically do that for all 4, as well as the passive. There's different setups for them. They have targeting actors and gameplay effects and all these different things that we apply to them to make sure they're actually fulfilling the sort of ability itself. Then I build all the internal kit interactions. If there's an ability that interacts with an ability, I've got to then start building that in because I needed both to be built in the first place. And then I start like polishing it up. So I add temporary sound. I take like sound from other currently made characters and stuff, and I'll like pitch it down or pitch it up and stuff, and mix and match the sounds to make different things that fit the character the best they can. Because sound, again, it's the same idea for playing dress up with the character. It's just to give clarity to testers and people interacting with the character on what's going on, so you don't just have silent assassin dummies running around doing all sorts of weird things that you don't understand. And then VFX too, and I try and always keep it thematic. If it's like an electric character, I'll use VFX from characters like Kwong in their assets and stuff, and Richter, and try and shift that around, maybe color shift it. Again, if it's a red character, I'll turn it red. You know, Unreal Engine is amazing. The more I've dived into it, the most incredible thing about that thing is just the versatility of I can take all these things and I can just, as someone who doesn't have extreme knowledge of any complex systems, shift the colors of these things, the materials of these things, the rate at which the lightning spawns, and the way it arcs through the air. All this stuff is super dynamic and super easy for me to get into, and I've learned to all as I've gone through. So yeah, and then you kind of have a prototype dummy ready, set up, and ready to be tested. We just ship it into an IT build.
Well, that like I was actually like impressed by the level of apparently the granularity of every single part, and also like apparently like the level of control that you can have. Of course, like I assume like it just like probably like still look a little bit like a Frankenstein monster a little bit when you're testing, but actually like that, because like the feel, I think like in a MOBA, and especially like in 3D MOBA, is so important that it's important like you go through all those steps. And I would assume like you get your kit on paper, and the first time like you kind of set up your character, I would assume like you're trying like the core gameplay loop, and you have like so many like little adjustments that you have to make on like the timings and all of that to actually like before you actually ship it to okay, people can actually like start testing it and see if overall it's working.
Yeah, I'll run through it in the engine as well to give it like a couple once overs, and I might even play it in a bot game just locally in engine. You know, my PC's not too bad luckily, so I can run 5 AI clients and play against it myself and just see, you know, how does the character play, and is it fulfilling the initial goals that it needs to, and if there's any clunkiness, bugs, or anything, then I can clean it all up and hope there's no lockups or anything weird. Yeah, it's still quite easy to make mistakes in the kit sort of development stage for the initial prototype kit, and bugs can easily get through. So yeah, but it usually gets pretty quickly recognized, and as said, the process is so much better now that it's much cleaner these days, when we initially start having these prototypes integrated into any testing environment.
And then like how does the process like okay, so you're pretty happy with like the prototype that you have made, and then like you kind of open up I guess like for people to be tested, and I would assume like then that gather like a first round on feedback, and then you can like iterate on it, and I guess like we do like multiple loop like that. So like already like how those loop are kind of working, like who are involved, and then also like then when do we know that we need to get out of that loop and we're ready to go like for the polish process, in a sense that we kind of say like okay, that's what we want.
Yeah, so most of the time, the whole design team is involved in some way, with feedback loops and understanding the character designs and stuff. Pretty much everyone will end up trying our characters internally, before they go out in terms of the design department, and before the kits are even ready for art or anything else to take over. So yeah, we're all involved with that. When it comes to like testing, you know, have different testing groups and stuff that we sort of like have with signed NDAs and everything, and they'll give us more controlled feedback, and we'll have big breakdown discussions and stuff. You know, just how does it feel interacting with this character against this character? You know, is there anything that's too frustrating? Is there anything that lacks clarity? Are there any situations you just don't understand that are occurring? Is there anything we can be doing better? You know, even within the scope of a prototype, and just is the concept of the character fun and stuff, and all this stuff, and we'll go away and we'll iterate on that, and that can be just weeks and weeks. It can be just, you know, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm fixing stuff up, I'm iterating on stuff and changing it. Thursday, Friday, we go and test it. We also do our internal dev tests where these things get tested, and our design play tests, so we can test them ourselves more easily, in a more controlled environment, with our QA team and everything. So we get to try them there, and again, everyone internally that plays the character in other play tests and stuff will also give feedback to us on that. So we often have flooding feedback all the time, and it's really good because this plays into my whole idea of I really want a fast iteration loop. I want this feedback ASAP because then I can iterate it if ASAP, and as soon as I can get it back to them, the sooner they can provide more feedback again. And the more we do that, the cleaner these things will be, or the faster we'll know this thing doesn't work or something, and we need to like re-envision something, or go back to drawing board on anything. So yeah, it's usually pretty quick. I really appreciate all the people that do give currently feedback on all our designs and stuff, particularly of heroes and stuff. It's like the most helpful thing in the world for me. If I didn't have it, I'm pretty sure most of the character designs we do pump out would be pretty subpar. But I think they're going to be way more refined with this process we have currently, and having all this feedback for it, which is really cool. It's very much like, again, these people that are sort of integrate with the community too. This is like community based feedback, and it's very much making the character with the community in that regard, rather than just we make it internally and think we know best for what's everyone. We want to know what people want to play. We want to know what people want to interact with and how we approach it. So we always take that stuff on like really heavily, and consider those really carefully. And not everything will obviously get changed. Sometimes there are things that are just the way they are. Sometimes the biggest thing I've learned in design as a whole, game design as a whole, is that there's almost never going to be a perfect solution to most of these issues, and it's always picking the lesser of two evils. And people will always be like, but this has such a big problem with X or Y, and it's like, yeah, but then you'd get Z if you did it the other way, and that's just horrible, and it just doesn't feel good. And so we in our best efforts and mustering the best of our intelligence, we will try and make the best decisions for what we know will be best for the players, even if things seem wrong. I assure you that anything else we could have done or comprehended would have been worse, when it comes to these kind of topics and stuff. That is very common, more so than I would have ever thought, going into design. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then once we're happy with all those feedback loops and everything, and the characters getting to this final polished design and stuff, it's starting to hand it off, right, in terms of art. Normally, if we're pretty far into the process and it's not like quite finished yet, but we're really happy with the sort of like, I'll call it like sort of the visual direction of the kit in terms of the kit itself. So all the elements of the kit would contribute to the visual sort of ideation of the character. So if this character uses a certain weapon and it has an ability that uses a certain element of the character and they spawn something in the world and all these things, as long as we know all of those will stay within the kit, so everything else is changing within that scope, we'll then establish that visual direction. And that means our team can start concepting that character design, basically, because they'll know all the visual elements we need, and even if we change the abilities or kit at all, it's within the scope of that visual direction. So then they'll start concepting, we'll get to the point where we're happy with the design that's done. When we hand it to them, they've got the concept art, they start making the model. They start concepting the sort of animations, so the concept artist will develop the character in its concept art form doing these abilities, so the VFX and animation have an easier sort of reference of what they're going to build. And I might do that with like Lucas or something and help him sort of like give feedback on him, on how these abilities should look in my initial mind of how I thought the character should be, and the sort of effects it should have. Should this VFX be like, silver or gold or whatever it may be? And should it be like more stars and sort of like stardust, or should it be like more lightningy and crackly, and things like this, and what elements of the character? And that's where sort of the narrative side of things more comes in. What is this character capable of from a narrative POV? How does that integrate into sort of the visual design of the character? And I'll start a feedback loop with him in order to help achieve that. And then it will get made. VFX people will start making it, animation people will start making it, sound people, as soon as all of that is done, can then start their sound work on those because they'll have the visual reference to build from. And that's pretty much the final stage. Once sound's done, that's it. It's closing and everything's polished from there on from every department. And my main focus from that whole stage is just balance for the character, so it lands in a healthy state pretty much.
Okay. Well, like there was a point that I really like is, it's true. Like, I would assume when you're a game designer, you're only one man, and having like all those feedback and people that actually like are, and I think like having passionate communities and passionate like also like people inside the own company means that people will naturally like want to test stuff and provide feedback and everything works correctly, and that basically like multiply the power of the game designer like tremendously, because at the end of the day it's only like one man. And like you kind of started already like to talk a little bit about like the other teams that needs to be involved, and then the balance. So like that's probably like the next direction that I'm going to go for. And regarding like the other team, I would assume like you already like discussed that you probably like sometime like you stay with the person responsible of the artist part and you just like discuss directly. But I would assume also like probably like there is like some documents that you just like, I would assume like there is the whole kit, like the document, and that gives me like a good point. So maybe we'll go like to the artistic part after, but like yeah, we have like Blood that shared a little bit of the process of like Kira being designed and having like the rework of the kits. And I think that could be like a good moment to just go through that before we go further into like the all the different like jobs that are worked on it. And so yeah, if I'm switching, so like from the document that I do have, there is like apparently like 7 different hero kits. I don't know if you want to Blood to like bring us like through them, maybe like what was interesting in this whole process and overall.
Yeah. So Kira's initial sort of like ideation, everything came very much from the whole sort of like obviously Demon Hunter concept. Was something that sort of like Robbie handed to me, and he's like, I think this is a really cool visual design, something that would fit in our game. We can do the lore time countess, and I want you to basically make a kit for this kind of visual design. And I was like, okay, I'll take that on. And I looked at references of sort of like what other games do similarly for this kind of concept, what other games sort of do with this sort of direction of a character, and sort of like implement sort of ideas of this. So I came up with essentially 4 kits. First off, for initial proposal on like different concepts that I see within these games and things that could be interesting. So the first one is sort of like this sort of like stealth idea to the character. What if we had a character that did essentially have stealth in its kit as an ADC? That's something that's like bit more unique. It's obviously quite hard to balance and stuff, especially true invisibility, not like a camouflage or anything for when it gets caught. But I was like, what would this look like if I made a whole kit around the concept of this character stealths? And then what are like other abilities I could sort of integrate that sort of made sense for the rest of the kit. Then I went on to make sort of like a more mobile kit that's about damage over time. Demon Hunters often have access to this kind of thing as a mechanic, and dealing damage over a period of time. So we've got not only is it sort of like contraptions and maybe some magic, but it's also like sort of alchemy and things like that that can be integrated into sort of their gameplay. So for example, this idea of like Nightbane or something, which is something that could be like a chemical or something that she utilizes in order to like deal damage over time, and then the whole kit is again encompassed around that concept. And sometimes these will sort of share mechanics amongst them, but overall they're like trying to hone in on one concept of what the character's trying to do. The third one's much more like playing at a distance than trying to assassinate a person with one big burst, and trying to kill them pretty quickly, so a bit more assassin-y. And the fourth one's being like a bit more sort of like elusive per se, and then it's a bit probably the closest we have to the current one, setting up basically like a really big AoE moment to like kill entire teams. And these kind of sort of like all the sort of directions I sort of approached her from. And these are the kind of kits we'd then sit down and talk about as a team and just be like, what's the direction we're liking most, let's align and see what do we think this Demon Hunter should be doing out of these, so I can then move on to like sort of the refining stage, which is the fifth one. And that's coming out of like the concept of like what do we want this character to be about. Vengeance was a really big keyword that we carried from that point onwards after alignment throughout the rest of the kit. The idea that she's obviously vengeance is something that's commonly associated with Demon Hunters, but we've also got this sort of trope of her chasing after Countess for vengeful reasoning, and therefore it's a really good sort of passive name for us and to build the kit around. So we came up with that concept. We also knew at this point we wanted the character to be mobile. We wanted a dash in the kit. There weren't very many of them in Paragon initially, only really TB pretty much, and he's going to be coming out a bit later. So we have time to implement that one now with a dash. And then we're just looking at different things we can do with like the crossbows and projectiles. Originally, we were actually going to have dual crossbows, very, very Valor from Demon Hunter, and you were going to like mainly just shoot with, you're going to alternate at first, but then we decided, well, actually, we kind of just want to shoot with one, and then use the other one for abilities. But then we also felt like that was silly, so then she should go back to shooting with both, because that actually makes sense. If she's got two, she should be using them. But then abilities didn't really like interact with it very well. When you do like an empowered basic attack, you kind of want a moment where the character actually does something before doing that attack, because the issue is it's going to be a basic attack reset in the gameplay loop. So if I'm holding a crossbow and I shoot and I shoot and I shoot, and then I use this ability, which is an auto reset, I'm going to shoot really quickly, and it's like really small like frames, because we have 0 frame basic attacks. Basically they come out instantly because that's what feels best for them. So auto attack resets are really difficult, so you actually want to have a moment where the character does something different. Initially that was going to be the concept of a hand crossbow and a wrist crossbow, and she'd bring the wrist crossbow up and shoot that. Instead we came up with the idea of the pistol, and sort of drawing that out instead, because we feel like that would carry a much more meaty and impactful shot and visually be more an interesting sort of like component of her, which is where her visual direction also started to get sealed when we include that pistol. We're like, yep, this is all the elements this character needs. This is where concept can start. Making our sort of like visual idea of what this character is going to look like within this predecessor universe, basically. And from there, I carried on refining the kit. I ended up stripping out sort of ideas of like hard wave clearance stuff for her. In a sense, with this ultimate, this idea of I've got this big AoE nuking ultimate. It's a very hard concept to balance for an ADC. And I think the way League did it is very good with scaling it of crit. It's a very smart way to do it. It's just one thing I borrowed. I think it's a very nice way to make it so it's not too impactful early, and she doesn't access itemization that allows her to build too durable or spell shields or things like this easily, without lacking damage. So just having the idea that that thing can crit is a really good mechanic for that. But secondly, it's also, you don't want the character to safely scale. It's already got a dash, so it's safe in lane. But then if you give it wave clear too, it's safe in lane, it wave clears, and it scales into team fighting stages of the game, and that's too overwhelming of a concept. It's got too many things that are sort of getting rid of its counterplay. So we ended up like scrapping a lot of the wave clear sort of potential with bouncing bolts and arrows and stuff, and save that for another kit idea in future. Which is where we started to get to the final kit, and we're like, yeah, much more single target focused. We've got abilities that synergize with the ult, with the passive. So you do your big ult, you get your big sort of like dusk proc and stuff. You can also use the dusk proc to slow enemies to then set up the ult, so you can more consistently land it all. We've got a nice sort of like evade and sort of like ADC loop where you're dashing around the outskirts and using your auto attack reset to play at a distance before actually going in to finish targets off. And that's how we essentially like sort of came to that conclusion. It was a pretty smooth one. It's not one that went through too much iteration. And the main reasoning for that is we had a very clear defined goal at the start, and there's tons of referencing for how this should function and work. We've obviously got like Reaper ult in Overwatch, which is a great reference for this, how it could look visually. And we were able to utilize that to make like a really cool visual experience for the character. So we were pretty confident in the way this would look visually and function in gameplay, that this was like the right direction and right idea. And we had our own flair of it, with the whole sort of like bird theme and sort of like raven theme of turning into a bird with the dash, which we thought was super cool. And Max did such a good job with that VFX. I think it looks stunning. That bird is incredible. So yeah, we were super happy with it at that point.
Well, that was like, I really like the story and like the different like aspect of like how like this kit like came to be. And like there is like a few points that I think was interesting. Like the first thing is like you had a core ID, but we started to already like build multiple kits to serve like the discussion initially, so we kind of refine exactly what we want. And there was like also like another point that we didn't talk about earlier when we were designing kit, but I think it's actually like interesting, is the fact that we don't want a kit that go in too many directions with too many like different effects. We still want to keep like some clarity and some like, I guess, unity when it comes to a character and a kit. And but it's fine because like you said, like, oh, that was a great idea. It's not needed to be there. It can be used like on another kit in the future, so it's never really lost in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And like we were saying earlier, when you brought up the whole overpowered ability idea, that these were kits that compromised of multiple overpowered abilities, and they were really cool. We were able to trim it down to its better parts and the parts that are most enjoyable for this kit, and put on weaker abilities with it to sort of work for it. And those kind of ideas of a basic attack that you fire into something and bounces between multiple targets, that's something we can use on a carry in future. The tech's now there, it's built, and the idea of the ability is still there, and we can use that in future like character kits if we want to, and we know what it does to the character and how it interacts in gameplay, and therefore we've got like a good sort of like direction if we ever want to take a character with that ability. So it's good that we explored it. It just wasn't right for this kit, and we came up with something that fit it a little bit better instead.
Well, thank you for sharing the process and like the bare bone document. Of course, like those are not like final Omeda documents. It's just like the thing that we can show on stream. So like don't take that as this is like the final work, of course. But it was like to be able to illustrate a bit the propo, and I think it was like interesting to get this whole like story behind. I actually like personally like really enjoyed it. So I guess we can like now come back to the topic that we're like going to initiate, which was like you were talking about the fact that then we like have the artists. Like from what I understood in general, like they're already like in the loop like pretty early on as well. Like they're already like providing feedbacks, IDs, and they already like kind of know where we are heading. And so I would assume like it's just like now they need to really like just like build the thing, which is like either like the 3D models, like all the animation, like the VFX, the sound, like also like you said. And so kind of like the pipeline, I would assume that there is an order, probably like we do 3D models before animation, otherwise that's a problem. And if I understood correctly, like, and if I remember correctly, you said also like the sound most of the time is like the final step. You just like
Yeah.
add the sound at the end. And how like this whole process kind of work, it's mainly like you have like some like master core document in a sense, like when you reference everything with giving intention, or it's mainly like since you're still like in this indie with like open chat like you were talking about, it's mainly like you just discuss directly with people.
Yeah, so very much it's more like talking and interacting more so at the current stage. Like I said, we're still pretty small. The whole process will be written out, but we're going to establish like what exactly it will be before we actually start putting pen to paper on that stuff. We don't want to write up anything that we're going to end up changing very recently anyway. So over the course of like Kira's life, she was a character that was sort of built over a very long period of time, much longer than we'd ever want, as we worked things out, we changed art direction, all sorts of stuff. And then Lizard has compressed that by about 50% in terms of the next time we've done it, which is amazing. We trimmed out all the big sort of like issues with it. And then furthermore, of the future characters, we'll be doing exactly the same. Once we're like super comfortable with the process, that's when we'll start documenting it. For now, everyone's kind of just on the same page of how these things go. A lot of people we have on board on the project, which is much unlike myself, are actually veterans in the industry, in other areas. So they know where, regardless of being a MOBA or not, where their sort of skills apply to the sort of character creation process, and what needs to be done first. So we're all kind of like naturally aligned in that regard because they already understand that, and I've sort of picked up on it and learned it as we've gone through the first character. So we're all kind of sold with that. And the way it basically goes, I hand that off. So we've got the concepting art. From that, models start getting made, and what they start with first is a sort of like lower poly placeholder model that's going to represent the right skeleton for the character, because every character pretty much has a unique skeleton of some kind, so we've got to make that. And they'll do like some basic materials on it, and it's just a very baseline representation of the character, kind of like a block out. And that's what we'll utilize initially for a while, and through testing, this is like the upgrade from the prototype dummy, basically. And this allows animation to start early and start working on the character early, because they have an animation and a rig. So Rohit is a rigger person, and he goes in and he starts sort of hooking the skeleton up with the mesh and everything, and making sure it animates all properly so that Brandon can then use it and develop his animations for the character. And he can start working on that then really early, at the same time as the higher poly and low poly final models get created for in-game and sort of marketing uses. So then they'll plow on with that based on the concept art. And meanwhile, as his concept are developing all of the sort of like VFX directions through their little concept art drawings and stuff that are working with me, then Max can come along and he can start developing those VFX on the character already, because we've already got like temp VFX, so he can just overwrite them as he works from the prototype character, and put them again on this sort of like block out model to see how they're going to look and how they're going to function. And it all sort of like builds up as like one group. It's never like just one thing at a time other than sound, but when it comes to the visual part of the character, all of it's done in tandem. And you'll slowly start to see like the initial like mocap of the animations that they do and then put in, and they obviously look very rough and there's lots of little issues with them, but then they get worked out and polished, and at the same time the model will get an upgrade, and at the same time the sort of VFX, the more abilities have more refined VFX and not the prototype VFX, and all of that sort of like keeps pushing, and that can take many months. Developing a character model for Pred takes a very long time. They're very high fidelity, much like our sort of like unique skins and stuff of like higher tiers are going to be very high fidelity. We have some incredible character artists that work on the actual models themselves. It's kind of incredible when you sort of like, we have these art syncs pretty much every week where they give updates on everything and how their work is going, and they'll dive into what they've done for this model, and they'll just zoom right into certain elements of it and like all these little things, and it's just like, this is like a hair follicle or something. I'm just like, oh my god, like what? This is crazy. But that's the level that Paragon went to with their character design visually that we try to replicate, and there's all these tiny little details to the character that we have to then recreate, whether it's the stitching on some clothing or whatever it may be, like a scratch or a scar or anything, and it's incredible. And then they do it so well, it creates such amazing sort of like character results. And yes, as then we go through that, and we have our animations updates, VFX updates, all the way into the point where the character is pretty much done visually, and sound can begin. They do start a little bit earlier once animation has finished run cycles and all the basic movement and everything, and maybe like basic attacks and stuff, basically non-ability interactions with the game, jump pads and all that. Sound can then sort of dive in and start working on those, as well as like once VFX have done them. So they try and like coordinate, this is how the character walks around, that doesn't need VFX usually, so then sound can immediately start on that. And then as sound is finishing up on that, maybe the basic attack is finished and the VFX is done for the basic attack, and then they can do that. Then the jump pad, recall, same idea, and you go through all of those, and sound can start on that. And they can start to work a little bit more adjacent, and then the abilities we kind of wait till they're all finished, because they can go through quite a bit of iteration. And when they're finalized, then sound can jump on that. And that's kind of the completion phase, and from there you've got some weeks where we keep testing the character, balancing the character, refine these VFX, refine the animations, figure out all the kinks if there's any bugs or anything, before we ship it.
Well, thanks you for all the detail. And there was like something I really liked about it is that we can feel the excitement and the passion when you were like talking about all those topics, and saying that was like, oh, that was amazing. I think like there is like one little part that I would like to cover when it comes to the thing is like the balance aspect of character. We didn't really like talk about it so far, and I guess like I would assume like at the very very early level when we're just trying to get a feel, like the numbers are not like the most important things, but when we get like to like the finalist kit, like slight change of numbers can completely change the feel of like is a early game monster to is actually like a monster in team fight, and all of that. And so I guess there is also like link to the fantasy of the character or what you want like the role is feeling. Can you
Yep.
develop a little bit on that?
Yeah, so a lot of like initial balancing is made in mind of the kit design. And as we progress that, so like what damage types of things, and are they more scaling heavy or base damage heavy and stuff, and things like this are all established fairly early in that sort of like paper design stage, because it actually contributes a lot to how the kit will feel to play. If certain abilities have certain like balancing elements to it, whether like this ability shreds armor, maybe that's something you want to use first in the kit, before using the other abilities. That's what it's kind of telling you, because it's going to increase the damage of your future combo and stuff. There's all these sort of elements that are put in, as well as like what does a player max as an ability first, right? Like that's super important. Like what ability is going to like feel like the bread and butter, the thing that you use all the time and stuff. That's probably the thing they're going to want to max. And how do we incentivize that, right? So you have to give it like more damage per level relative to other abilities, or maybe it decreases in mana, or it doesn't increase in mana and the others do, or cooldown reduction, whatever it may be. And all that can get factored in. So you sort of do this sort of like outline sort of balancing, which is more on the line of feel balancing, like how should the character feel to play and everything, and how should all these things complement that. And then from there, there's pretty much two other elements to it. So it's mechanics and number balancing, pretty much. It's like mechanic balancing falls more on the lines of like how potent are the mechanics of this character, right? So if I have an ability and it's an AoE and it's a big AoE, that's quite a strong ability in theory based on what it would do. If it does damage, okay, that's pretty powerful. Now it has a stun, so now it's a large AoE stun. That's got a lot of power budget now. That's like a mechanic basically, as sort of an idea. And you can sort of boil down all the abilities of a character into this kind of like scoring system. And then you can use that to then compare characters more easily in terms of are they sort of like matching what they should. So in a general sense, ADCs usually have lower mechanical scores. They have less larger AoEs, less utility, less large CC, because a lot of their power budget is in ranged basic attacks. That takes up a lot of it already. Whereas a character that's more like a support usually has quite a big power budget in their abilities, because they have very low damage numbers and they don't synergize very well with items in a certain way, and they just don't deal big sort of damage numbers, and therefore they'll have a lot more utility, a lot more mechanics in the kit, so their scores are expected to be higher, whereas everything else falls usually within that spectrum. And obviously there's slight exceptions, but in a general sense that's kind of what we follow. When you do this sort of like assessment, comparing Paragon to Pred heroes, it's super interesting. When you're comparing like the mechanics of Chimera from our game to Paragon heroes, you'll notice this score increases a lot. Essentially, one thing when revitalizing these Paragon heroes is we felt like they didn't have enough to them on an average level to have enough depth to interact with. So that's why we not only give them active abilities instead of passives, but like for example, like Feng Mao, we gave like the alt resetting and stuff, right? That's like an extra mechanic that can take up a big part of his power budget now, and that can like elevate a character to have a lot more depth and a lot more interesting sort of moments that will basically help retention. So this is like one thing we use very closely in order to sort of assess if a character is going to be just has too many mechanics in general in its kit, or if it's got too little, and how can we elevate our characters up to that level and stick within sort of that general scheme. Then the other side is sort of like number balancing, and number balancing is super interesting because in a general sense, you're never going to get it right for a long time. Character might come out slightly unbalanced, and even if it comes out slightly unbalanced, it's probably going to be unbalanced for years or fluctuate between balanced and unbalanced for years to come. The character will always have so many external things that are impacting it, and its numbers are one way to keep it in sort of like a nice state of flux, basically, where it's not going to be too extreme, and things won't like shift around all the time. So there'll always be tweaks and stuff, but initially the general sort of concepts is higher base damages makes character more reliant on levels, whereas scaling is more reliant on items. Is obviously a general concept, and then sort of like when you're looking at sort of those bread and butter abilities and stuff, when those numbers are higher, they're going to be better early game. Whereas if their base damage numbers are spread out very evenly across the kit, they're more of a late game character because as they hit like towards level 18, that's when all the numbers start to come off online. You've got scalings that go up per level, those play more into late game kits. You've got percent health damage, these are things that are more anti-tank but also scaling, so they're better into the late game. And one thing that I always find is interesting is the concept of missing health and current health values. People see these values and they see like 20% current health, and it's like, wow, that's an insane amount of damage. And on one level it is, but then you've got to start factoring all the other factors where, you hit this skill shot, it does 20% health damage, okay, but then maybe they're half HP, so it's 10%. And then maybe they have armor, so now it's like 6% or something. Maybe it's even like 5%. And then it's just like, it ends up doing like 50 damage, and it's like, okay, a normal ability in that case would have done like 300 plus damage or something, right? And it's a really interesting part when start considering these percentages and post mitigation sort of numbers. So that's why reading kits can always seem really like strong, right? When you get that overpowered sense, and numbers can contribute a big part of that. Even max health damage is the same to a degree. When you start calculating what like 8% max health damage means post mitigation on characters, especially like physical damage, where a lot of characters have naturally high physical armor, even squishy characters. That damage doesn't actually end up amounting to a lot, and having things that do large flat damage numbers are actually way greater, especially against those squishier targets. So there's lots of like little traps you can fall into, and you always have to go back to that MOBA knowledge and what we know. I've played MOBAs for most of my life. I know how a lot of these things interact, and therefore it allows me to make better. Not perfect, never perfect. I'm going to make tons of mistakes all the time. I 100% know I will. But in general, I should be able to make a good assessment of, is this character going to be basically balanced on release? And I think our releases have been pretty much there. If anything, they should probably be stronger so the character's more exciting when it's released, because I feel like we could push a little bit more that direction. But for example, like Greystone Margash and stuff, I think they've landed in pretty healthy states, and they're not too overwhelming to players. And that's where that sort of like previous MOBA knowledge can come in. I've seen all the mistakes games like Riot and Hi-Rez have made with their games, and the sort of patches we've had to go through and experiences we've had and what influenced that. And therefore I can avoid those pitfalls, which is super cool for me. And then we'll fall into our own pits and then have to figure out how we get out of those. So yeah, super interesting. But there's a surprising amount in the design of this game, not just in Heroes, but the game as a whole, that's kind of there under the sort of like sort of face, that's actually like driving a lot of different interactions and stuff. Like, how do we prevent multiple hunts being born, being abused and stuff? The way we tie like support crests to stop people sort of interacting in negative ways with like rift walkers and stuff. We avoid the locket issue that League had with like junglers and top laners running locket in League for a certain period of time, or in Paragon quenching scales, by having these tied to support crests, which means that people can't buy multiple of them and stuff. So we've come up with like all these like different solutions and stuff that solve the same issues these games ran into to create like a more healthy environment for people to play into. sort of preemptively. And that's the same with characters. We can avoid the same pitfalls other games have, and that's really beneficial to us.
Yeah, definitely taking experience from like the past. Like if people already have made the mistake, there is like no point of starting and like reinventing the wheel when the wheel is already
Yeah.
there. So then there was like a very interesting part like about like all the parts we were talking about the scaling, the base stat, and I thought it was like very informative.
Mhm.
So I think I have like two more questions, and then we're like probably like reaching like the end of global like covering like the character creation process. So there was like one question like I've captured from the chat earlier, which was like asking like, do you plan to integrate a little bit more like verticality in the future kits of the future heroes? I think that's a question that comes like regularly because we're a 3D MOBA with like the Z-axis, and like how do you plan to take advantage of that? You were already talking about the flying character a little bit earlier. Well, I don't know if it was like character, but about like the concept of the abilities, and maybe you have like other stuff to share there.
Yeah, no, there's definitely stuff we want to include more so. There's a fine line between just the concept being too strong and not in our environment when it comes to mobility. Like, mobility creep is already something that happens to MOBAs in an extreme way, and verticality is only going to play more into that if we lean heavier into it. The map also isn't the perfectly designed environment for these to exist currently. There are some awesome plays that can be made in certain locations with it, whether it's around the pits or certain parts of the jungle or the side lane like drop downs. There are some cool moments and stuff, but it could arguably do more. The issue is the more you put that in, the more you need these characters to have vertical impacting elements quicker and more of your cast to do so. You don't want characters like Grux and stuff just feeling like they're always stuck in the mud and can't interact with the
Yeah.
rest of the game, because everyone else can go up ledges and stuff and he can't, and that's just really sad that no one wants to play Grux, right? And Grux is a really bad character, and then you have to make Grux do the same thing, and eventually everyone starts doing that, and then you have got mobility creep and arguably a very different game. We do want to make sure our mobile characters are still represented well in that regard, and that they're still playable. I think there's a lot of cool things you can do with the concept of a character that doesn't interact as much with it. But I would like more vertical impacting characters, but like I said, in more unique and controlled ways is the best way to approach it first, where we do those like extreme verticalities and stuff, and sort of like limited interaction with them, like how it's at all where he's not able to like basic attack in the air. Things like this are like a really nice controlled way to do it, and more things like that are definitely things we'll be exploring, more short term than the longer term, where we would look at more like flying characters and characters that leap and interact with the aerial elements and stuff. But lots of the stuff we've prototyped and tested, we've had some crazy stuff happen that's not on the floor. I can say that it can get pretty crazy and hectic sometimes. The concept of spatial awareness is very difficult in third person games, but our game especially. And sometimes you do just completely lose track of people as people are flying around, and that can be disorientating and hard for us to overcome as like challenges. So there's definitely like more tech we probably need to build in and designs to sort of like resolve. Like if Howard is in the air, maybe we need like a thin line that points to the ground directly below where he is with a little circle, so someone's above me here, there's something there, and I look up and then I can see Howitzer. There's things we can do for like indication that we can do better here, and we need to explore those, and when we refine those, these things are more easy for us to implement in a way that isn't frustrating for users to then interact with on the other end, and the receiving end of this stuff. So we do have to be a little bit careful with it, but it's definitely stuff we'll be exploring.
That sounds exciting, but yeah, I fully agree with you on the part that it can be rough because if basically this type of ability, like you said, can like really like wrap a game around it, and it's like finding the right balance is always like super super duper tricky. So,
Yeah.
and I guess like I can like go for like the latest question I have for you. Well, it's not really the latest question, but like we've discussed a little bit about like whole this process of like how you get like from the initial day one, like you want to create a character, and then like we were talking about like probably like the months when there's like the artistic part to be made. And so like, do you have a rough idea of like how long like from this day one process until like the character is ready to be added to the game kind of take? And as a disclaimer for people in chat, like I don't want this answer for people to tell like, oh, if we say like a certain number, that means that we will have a character every like this number. No, because then you can work on parallel. There's like so many different things. You can have things in the pocket. But just like overall, like this character, like how long doing a character, like how amount of work that represents in general.
Yeah, it's certainly large, and it's a good thing to bring up, and I think it's actually good for us to share. Is that so? Kira did take like a year at least. It was probably a bit longer, and that was because it was such a rough process across the entire thing, and we almost did it twice, kind of thing, with how we went about it. Lizard has pretty much over halved that currently, so more towards that sort of like 6 month period, at least for what we're aiming for. It's very hard. There's still lots of things that are difficult with it, and refining it to such a point that it feels like a Paragon level character in terms of visuals and everything, without all the bugs and messes and issues with it, particularly in locomotion systems and all this stuff, is tricky. But yeah, we're pretty confident in that one, and it should only get a little bit shorter from there. There's always more refinement we can do. Maybe we compress it to 4 months and stuff, depending how it goes. Maybe that's unlikely. At the end of the day, modeling takes a certain amount of time. When we're getting more unique creations, people want non-humanoid designs. If we're going to be making giant monsters and mechs and stuff and all this kind of stuff, that can require a lot more modeling. On the other hand, maybe we make a really small squirrel character or something, and that's actually a lot less modeling. So there's also, it can go both ways, and maybe we can be a bit more efficient about it. Like you said, multiple parallel pipelines is the goal. That's how we're going to produce characters quickly and efficiently. Like Ace shared on the Predcast, we are planning on trying to keep the cadence up when the Paragon heroes are done and they're all out the way and we're on purely uniques. We're going to try and keep the cadence up. Whether that will be one per month, I'm not sure. Maybe it ends up falling to one every 2 months or something. We should have a decently sizable cast by that point. Maybe it'll be time to slow down a little bit more. Maybe it's every 6 weeks or something instead. Or not 6 weeks, sorry, that would be really quick. Maybe like maybe like 8 weeks, something. Yeah, 2 weeks, 2 months rather. I think is a decent sort of like point. But we'll see. We'll see what we end up with. It depends how fast it speeds up, and more hires and stuff, and more parallel sort of workflow, being in production, all that stuff, and we might end up with a better state. And a lot of what I'm trying to do these days is refining our game design side of all of that, refining the whole pipeline of prototyping characters and making sure there's constantly kits in testing, constantly new characters being created and new mechanics being tested so that we can have a nice big backlog of characters. And even if we are struggling to produce a character for a certain point, we can pull these designs forward, and we can then push those forward towards art and stuff and make sure they're done. So having more like pre-done sold kits basically in the design side of things is really good for us. And that should allow us to keep the pipeline smooth for as long as possible, basically.
Well, thank you for the insights. And now I think I'm going to go like for the last question, which is like, any spoilers regarding Lizard?
Regarding Lizard,
Yeah.
so he uses a shield. He also uses a spear. That's his primary weapon that he will be fighting with. He has very, as I said, he's sort of related to Feng Mao in a sense. And culturally, he doesn't necessarily fit in with the more Eastern vibes that sort of Feng Mao fit in with. He's a bit closer to more of a Western vibes, and I'd probably associate him closer with like Rome and such in terms of the sort of visual and kit vibes you might get off of him and the mechanics he may have. Some stuff might feel familiar, some stuff might feel pretty unique. There's some really cool play patterns in there. I've worked quite a long time with this kit. He's got some really cool combos. He will have a hard CC, but it's going to be difficult to access. And I will tell you now that this character, from a more narrative perspective, as we've stated, this character is all about ascending. He wants to basically become a god. He's very boastful. He's very full of himself. He thinks he's pretty much the most overpowered thing on the planet. He thinks he literally already is a god and he deserves that. He thinks everyone's below him in that regard. That doesn't mean he hates other people that are below him. He just knows he's above people, basically. He will treat them all equally with respect, but himself above that. And he also wants what's best for everyone, but that means that he needs to be above them in order to achieve that, and that's what he wants to do. So yeah, that's pretty much a lot of his direction, and I think you guys will be super happy to see where he lands with his kit. It's very fun.
That sounds pretty cool, and definitely like RG's Ace was already like saying like Lizard will be blown away by the character, and like we really also feel like the excitement from like I see that you want to share it with us and that we discover the character in a sense. So I can't wait to be able to play it in the game. So yeah, we're reaching like the end of this interview. So first of all, like thanks a lot, Bloodmordius, for coming, being like so open about it and discussing in depth on all those topics. I really enjoyed my time here. I think it was very informative. I hope like the chat also as well. Thank you everyone for the chat, like from tuning in. As a little like information, like there won't be any Mugi's Prime Plan for the next 2 weeks. Like overall, like there is no tournament like that will come out. Also, like a team are kind of taking a break, so the In the Mind of a Pro will also take a break. So I will take advantage of that time to work on like future project, also like for the Predecessor scene. And yeah, thank you everyone once again. Thank you, Bloodmordius, for coming and sharing a bit of your time with us all. That was very appreciated and really enjoyable time.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's really fun to share these processes with people, and like I said, we should be as clear cut as we can with everyone, and let you guys know how we operate and what we're thinking of, and how we try to be inclusive to all the feedback and everything that you guys give. It's always appreciated. This community's been absolutely fantastic, and I really look forward to the future of not just iGame but hero design in particular. Within Pred, I think it's super exciting. We're going to do some really cool stuff with character creation.
And thank you everyone, and have all a wonderful weekend. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Bye everyone.